Greetings, webheads, and welcome to episode 18 of Witty Banter, yet another Marvel Crisis Protocol podcast. I'm Patrick.
I'm Alex.
I'm David.
I'm a mushroom cloud laying motherfucker.
And we get our explicit rating right off the top. Let's go. We are here to help you get better at and have more fun with your Crisis Protocol. We don't have a ton of other business to take care of any other than just ask you to follow us and help us out. We're basically going to boil things down to one topic, and it's a topic that David had a concept of. Functionally, it's discussing the 5 archetypes of Crisis Protocol rosters. So, without too much further ado, David, can you just kind of lay out the idea you had, where it came from, and sort of just basically give a description of what it was you're thinking about?
So in Omnis's Discord, shout out to Omnis's Discord, we were having a big discussion about how some people have been like labeling rosters as like, oh, this is an attrition roster, this is a scoring roster, this is, mid-range or whatever. And we started to get into the debate of, is an attrition roster really an attrition roster, or is it just a beat up roster or like a beat down roster, right? Because attrition implies that you want to have more models alive at the end of the game than your opponent does, but like sometimes that doesn't, I mean, usually you're just meaning beat down, right? So I figured we got into this big debate and we were discussing it and trying to like, and I was thinking that it's just like, now that as the game has grown, there's just more teams that do different things. So I figure it's worth talking about like how I view like the meta as a whole, and like, because I think this is an important thing to learn how to do, because you want to be able to like look at your opponent's roster across the table from you and kind of have an idea of what their game plan is going to be based on their roster selection and their crisis selection, right?
So, in other words, saying something that is an attrition may not necessarily be terribly specific, and there might be, well, it could be attrition doing this and attrition doing that, and it doesn't by itself help you. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Because like, there's multiple, like, even okay, we'll start into actually going into the archetypes. So I guess the first archetype I'll talk about is what I call aggressive scoring. So these are the teams that want to like jam up all the extracts that they can get. They want to hoover them up and run away, and then just basically try to coast out a win by keeping parity on the secure and then holding all the extracts for as long as they can.
So
and the teams that want to do this are like webs, right? Like webs want to do this, and I'm starting to get the idea that Xavier X-Men want to do this because they just have so many shenanigans to like get extracts. And the same with like Mystique Brotherhood. I think Mystique Brotherhood also is kind of this way.
So aggressive there, you're not talking about aggressive in a beat people up sense. You're talking about aggressive in a hurry up and grab the extract and run away sense.
Yeah, usually they're going to want to have somebody who can like dive into your back lines and steal one of your back extracts, like an Amazing Spider-Man or something like that, or even a Black Cat. Somebody who can go out there and steal an extract and probably stay alive, or at least hopefully stay alive, or at least you have a plan to stay alive. Like what I've been doing a lot with Xavier X-Men is I'll like double move Nightcrawler, pick up a mid objective, bump back, pass the power to Xavier, or pass power to Shadowcat. The Shadowcat will go double move, steal your back extract. She'll bounce back, pass the power to Xavier, and then I'll Tumi my X-Men, both of them back, and I'll have them so far in my back line that it's hard to get to them.
Okay. So how would that differentiate from what most people would think about in terms of the way they differentiate rosters now? How would carving out that little slice or making it that more specific make it easier to understand exactly what a particular roster is trying to do and differentiate it from other rosters?
Well, and that goes into the next roster, which is or the next type, which is like I call it. I mean, you could call it like defensive scoring or some sort of like bully or control, or basically you want to take all the secures
Okay.
and then you want to throw your opponent off of them all, and then just try to keep parity with extracts, right?
Okay.
It's basically the opposite. Instead of going and stealing their extracts, you're trying to steal their secures or bully
Okay.
them off the secures.
So one's
So
like
like
no, go ahead.
Kingpin is the perfect example of this kind of roster, right? Like
So
Kingpin
you
wants to do it. I'm trying to think of who else is pretty good at doing it. I think Wakanda kind of wants to go that direction now that they nerfed um since they got rid of R&D, right? So now it's harder for them to have extract shenanigans.
okay.
But I mean, they still have a lot of pushes and control, and they can still like they can dominate you on Gamma if you're not careful.
Okay. So one's kind of a secure based scoring team, one's an extract based scoring team.
I think also Hellfire Club falls into that category too, right? Where they just want to, and you could even to some extent Sam, right? Because Sam wants to go wide and score a bunch of secures and try to keep himself alive long enough to score out.
Okay.
Do you think Kingpin helps break him into the other archetype with his other half of his leadership, being able to pass
With the passing?
extracts around?
I mean, there's probably. I mean, that's a what? That's a really good late game strategy, right? Like, didn't somebody do that to you at an event where they used what's that card? The you can't target me outside of 2 late game to
Oh,
like
Shadow
keep
Orc.
Kingpin alive. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like pass power to Kingpin and hold him in the back. And not every roster is going to be doing these archetypes at every time, right? Like sometimes you might get into a situation where you're like, I want to be aggressive scoring right here, but maybe it might not work as well as I think it will, or maybe my opponent has like some kind of plan to like counter what I'm doing. If that
Alex,
makes sense.
Alex, what do you think about those two distinctions? What kind of comes to mind when you hear those descriptions?
I mean, David's pretty solid, spot on about it. I could lean with JP on his opinion with Kingpin, being able to do something like that, being like an aggressive scoring because of the extract game, especially if you're playing like Legacy Virus with Toad, being able to pass objectives or steal objectives would be pretty quick.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I do like that.
Maybe we should take a quick step back before we get in too much detail. David, in your thought, why is it important to be more specific in terms of being able to describe a roster? What benefit do you have to be able to have an understanding of what you're trying to do clearer in that way?
Well, I mean, it's like you know any you know any saying in any competitive game, right? If you know what your opponent is doing, then you have an advantage, right?
Okay. Well, and I suppose if you know what you're doing with your own roster too, you're going to be more focused in on exactly what your plan is to be successful and to get to 16 as efficiently as possible. So it probably works both ways.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it helps to like be able to identify based on what the crisis layout is, like how it's going to score.
Okay. Maybe let's just to make it easier to kind of to talk through 'em, maybe list out the 5 archetypes that you had thought about, and then as we talk about them, kind of like we did with the 2 scoring ones, we might be able to sort of differentiate them with the other archetypes. Because really the whole point of having these archetypes is to differentiate them from the others. So maybe it'll help to have the menu of them up front, and then we can talk our way through and figure out how they differentiate from each other, how they can synergize with each other, how you can maybe at times do a little from column A and a little from column B. So what are the 5 archetypes that you're thinking about?
So we've got, I said, aggressive scoring, and then we've got defensive scoring. I
Okay.
think that's just the easiest way to call it, like potatoes, basically. That's what you're looking for.
Okay.
And then you've got tall attrition, which is basically trying to maintain priority, get dazes and KOs, and take activations so that your opponent just can't react to you. And then there's what I call wide attrition, which that's like Shield and Shadowland Daredevil, the guys that just want to like take as many characters as they can and make as many attacks as they possibly can at you, right?
Okay.
And try to get rerolls and other mechanics that help them, you know, push you over. And then there's Midrange, which Midrange is a little weird. Midrange is kind of like they basically want to hover in the middle area of the game. They don't want the game to score too fast, but they don't want it to score too slow. And they want it to basically like to strategically place damage on characters to like have a round where you can go, okay, it's round 3 or 4 and I can maybe push this score over. So I'm gonna like take a couple models activations and then push the score over and win the game, basically.
Okay.
So, like a
So
good analogy might be like dweebs,
Yeah.
and then like the kids who stayed in taekwondo class long enough to get a black belt, and then the weightlifters, the gang members, and the baseball players.
Yeah. I like that actually.
if if we could end up making this episode just entirely go back to the movie The Warriors and have everybody have like the jackets with the logos on them, I think that'd be fantastic. I'm all
Hell yeah! I just
I'm
watched
all-
that movie.
Everybody's got to like represent whatever their archetype is.
Tall attrition, come on out.
I didn't realize that one, the guy who shot the main dude at the beginning,
Yeah.
was T-Bird from The Crow.
Oh,
Really?
I didn't know that.
Yes. If you go back and watch it, it's fucking T-Bird. Second
Oh
thing
my
I
God.
noticed was the chick on the radio was like John Wick was like a total love letter callback to the movie when they were putting the hit out on John Wick.
Yeah. That makes a ton of
Okay.
sense. Well, any excuse I have to go back and watch The Warriors, I'm going to take. So thank you. Now I have 2 of them. Okay, so at some level, we've got 2 different flavors of scoring. We've got 2 different flavors of attrition, and then we've got mid-range, which... So is mid-range actually a separate thing, or is it just kind of a roster that's neither fish nor fowl? Is it... I mean...
I think it is its own thing, but
Okay.
it's kind of a jack of all trades. Like it could kind of do these kind of rosters are kind of going to want to do a little of both at the same time. Right? Like strategic, like dazing and
So
KOing of models.
So what's a good example of kind of a true mid-range team? Because I see that a lot, and I hear discussion about that a lot, and I'm trying to figure out what the difference between something that's a mid-range team and something that's just like, yeah, it's an attrition team, but it's just not as good as an attrition team. So what's the difference?
I mean, I think you're like the basic archetype for a mid-range team is usually going to be Avengers, right? Like Avengers usually fit that category of like they can put the beat down on when they need to, but they can't just like it's hard for them to get like extreme like they're not going to
What
like just like blow you off the table.
Okay. Is that just because their roster is so wide that they can basically have one of everything?
Well, and the leadership's especially Steve One's leadership is so flexible in its
Okay.
versatility that you can do a lot of different things. Right?
Okay.
Like you can use it to like discount throws. You can use it to like get you can use it to get to extracts that you normally can't, right? It has a lot of flexibility in it.
JP, what are your thoughts on mid-range teams? I guess that's always a concept I've kind of struggled with, and I just, what do you think about a team like that? I know you've have some Avengers play in your history.
I think the definition of mid-range in this game would be a team that doesn't do either of the extremes very well and tries to do the opposite of what its opponent's doing. Which
Okay.
I don't know. So, like, if you're playing against Webs with Avengers, you try to beat them down. If you're playing against, like, Red Skull 3, you try to outscore them.
Okay.
Whether, like, historically that hasn't really worked very well in this game, generally speaking. Like in trading card games, mid-range is definitely a thing, and there will be metas where mid-range is really, really good. This game, I mean, I would say mid-range is probably not as good as the other archetypes, generally speaking. Again, like there are some good teams, and I think it comes down to a lot to like who's piloting it too.
Yeah.
Like a good pilot can pilot like a solid like B plus A tier list against like
Yeah.
S tier lists and win.
Yeah, I would have
Yeah,
to
I
agree
mean
with
like
that one. I
Sooner
feel like
did that with his Avengers
Steve 3.
roster, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't see Steve 3 coming at all. That completely blindsided me.
Yep.
In my book, in my mind, like Steve 3 was like not great, but I mean, it won NashCon, so it's got to be something to it. He definitely built the list with a philosophy, though.
Okay.
He definitely
he
did.
designed it specific in a very specific way. So, but I think to go back to answer your question a little bit, Patrick, I know we haven't touched on the scenarios, but I don't think there's as much granulation in the scenarios. I don't think it's 5 there. I think you're down to 3 at that point. You get your like ultimate beatdown scenarios, your ultimate scenarios, or ultimate scenario play scenarios, and then like your kind of mid-rangey scenarios. So
Well, and David, it kind of sounds like your ideas with archetypes. I mean, you're still realistically, there really is only kind of 2 processes to win the game. Either you go ham on the scoring and try to score real fast, one way or the other, or you go ham on killing your opponent so they can't score fast. I mean, I think I'm not really sure the game really permits another way to win. I mean, is that overly simplistic in terms of breaking down the goal of the game? I mean, the idea with the archetypes is the different ways to get to the game, which affect both how you play and how you would play against them. But at the end of the day, I think those are the kind of the 2 options. Is that simplifying things too far?
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily simplifying it too far. Like, I mean, I still think like some rosters are like gonna get closer towards the like tabling side of you
Yeah.
versus some rosters will get more to the like I'm just gonna beat you up until I can score enough.
Right. Okay. Um, I want to take a step back, JP. I want to go back to the idea of kind of the 3 basic ideas, but we were talking a little bit about mid range, and sort of the idea of a mid range is being able to pivot to what your opponent's not good at and go at them with that. Alex, do you think that means that running a mid-range team has a higher skill requirement because you have to be able to score well with a team that's not as good at scoring, or you have to kill well with a team is not as good as killing. So do you think it's fair to say that a mid-range team probably has the highest skill ceiling that would be involved?
I would have to say yes. Just because you got to put more thought into it than just more so what am I good at. You got to know what your opponent's bad at, and then you also have to keep in mind that I don't think there's a single mid range that I can think of that plays the same as another mid ranger.
Okay.
Because like all the Avengers, just for one example, all three of those Avengers, excuse me, four. I forget Hulkbuster's an Avenger leader, but if
You,
we're just like
you're
comparing Steve 1 and
We
Steve
don't talk
3.
about
you're
Hulkbuster's leadership.
you're forgiven for forgetting Hulkbuster. I think that's a given.
But like Steve 1 and Steve 3, they're like Steve 1, I feel as though wants to play more like potato score, but knows that playing against an aggressive, like a uh, aggro team, they're not going to be great at scoring to begin with, and it's really just a matter of out surviving the aggressive team. But then Steve 3 is kind of the opposite. I feel he's more punchy and less potatoy than Steve 1. So he kind of wants to go a little more on the punchy route, but can play that scory route too.
Okay.
Well, the other big thing with mid-range teams too, right, is the margin of error is smaller, right? Because you don't have the ability to like just go completely aggressive and take a bunch of points and then try to coast out, right? And you
Right.
also don't have the ability to like just completely roll somebody over, right? So your opponent is got more of a window to play in there to try to win, right?
Okay. Let's I mean, I think the names probably do a pretty good job of describing it, but um David, let's finish off and give a more detailed description and basically maybe some examples of wide attrition and uh narrow attrition. I guess I forgot the two that you called. But why don't you let's
Tall attrition.
all attrition. Let's um why don't you give a little more detail about that, give some examples and kind of give some description for the listeners on exactly what it is specifically that you're referring to. This it's relatively obvious from the term, but let's go ahead and just lay it out there.
Well, I mean, tall attrition is, I mean, obviously the base, like this is the like pure archetype of tall attrition would be Black Order, right? Like if you're talking about like Thanos, Corvus Proxima, right? Like that is the traditional tall. I'm going to manipulate priority. I'm going to daze models at the top of the round, and I'm going to take activations, right? Like that's what they do. I mean, there's not much more to that. I mean, there's obviously you can go like I think Mal still has tall attrition there. I think um
It's kaiju basic.
yeah, it's
It's
kaiju. It's your
kaiju.
big boys because you have to have high threat models to be tall, right? So
Right. Okay. And then and I know you kind of described it too. So wide attrition, you're still doing the same thing where your primary game plan is you just want to murder to either table opponent or make them lose activations to the point where you've got a scoring advantage that way. So what's describe that in a little more detail.
well, the thing with wide attrition, right, is that wide attrition, they're not going to care about prio because it actually probably benefits them to not have prio so that you can because a lot of teams like Shield and specifically, right, have ability to go, okay, I want you to have priority because I want you to have that activation at the top of the round for you to do whatever it is you're going to do with your your like crazy model, and I'm gonna have like defensive abilities to like negate that activation, right? Like shield has like eye in the sky and like all these like tricks to kind of go, okay, well I can mitigate your top of the round activation, and now once you've activated that guy, I can just put all my resources into him and kill him, right?
Okay.
So that's like that's the way that kind of works.
Okay. So JP, you were talking about how, you've got these 5 different archetypes, but it doesn't necessarily change categorization in form in terms of the scenarios. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you meant by that?
It's just I think there's there aren't. I don't even know if there were more scenarios if it would change the fact. But like scenario play wants to have the maximum amount of points on the board, so they're going to play all the scory stuff.
Yeah.
Attrition wants to minimize the amount on the table, so they're going to play all the like the 3-point extracts and like the C and E secures to force fights. And then mid-range, they don't want to paint themselves into a corner typically. So they're gonna take like the stuff that doesn't score as fast but can still win by scoring. So stuff
And it
like
typically
hammers and
has
scrolls.
they're even numbers so that you can keep the game close. Because like if it's an odd number extract or secure, right? If your opponent is like camping that for 2 or 3 rounds, now they're
Right.
going to be up on score more than opposed to like if we're both on a B and we're sitting across from each other and not moving the score, then it just kind of stays close.
So
Yeah, I guess going back to what David was saying about the aggressive scoring, you don't want to give, say like webs, you don't want to let them have more extracts than you have, because then they can run around and just score one more around than you, and like just rotate on you and make you waste actions and activations just chasing them. Whereas going back to, I don't know what he called it, the other type of scenario, like
Defensive.
Kingpin,
Yeah, like
defensive. Kingpin and like in Hellfire inherently want to sit on points because Kingpin counts as 2, and Emma, the trigger leadership, you need to be contesting or holding, contesting a secure or holding an extract. So not like obviously not everybody can be holding an extract, so they want to get as many asses in seats as they can. So you don't want to have like an uneven amount in case you lose prio and they pick your reds, because then you're sitting there on like, I shouldn't say uneven. You don't want to play the 5s. Like maybe as a mid range you might play a 3, but even then I don't know. I think the 4s are probably better because it gives you more of a chance if you're going against attrition. But like if you lose prio and you have a 5, like say like spider infected, they grab the mid, they can just run around and outscore you by 1 every round until you figure something out. And they're way good at running around because they're dweebs.
David, do you think that the 2 different, either the 2 different attrition teams or the 2 different scoring teams, do they have different scenarios in mind, or are they both still kind of like attrition wants attrition-y scenarios and scoring wants scoring-y scenarios? I don't know if that's a word or not, but it is now.
So I would say like, I mean most of the fighty teams are going to want to play like research, or like they're going to want to play the 3s.
Yeah.
But a team like, so a wide attrition team like for instance Shadowlands Daredevil, I don't know if Shadowlands Daredevil wants to play research that much because of the way his leadership works, because it's harder to get rerolls if there's only 3 points on the board, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So maybe they want to reach for the stuff that the mid range is looking at, so that maybe they take scrolls and hammers and that kind of thing.
Okay. So, Alex, if kind of putting if we're looking at these kind of 5 categories, does that modify or clarify your roster building in terms of how you would prepare for different rosters? So if and maybe we're kind of doing this already and just not having a name for it, so maybe it'll help just being able to call it something. But does that put clarity or provide some insights in terms of your roster building to challenge opponents?
Yeah, I mean, we've done this just in our community, or at least a few times that we've talked about rosters in our group chats and just
Mhm.
on game nights. Yeah, I think the roster building, with these different archetypes, it kind of, since I've been thinking about it this way, it's put me on a perspective of looking on both sides because, kind of like JP says, some of those rosters, they don't want to play the 5 point scoring extracts, and I could also see even scoundrels, depending on who it is, but thinking about who can score those better than you, and uh, I don't. Yeah, I just think it does put a different perspective to it, and uh, for myself, it put it in a sense of unlocking a different way of playing the game instead of trying to win as quickly as possible. Sometimes thinking about how you can slow it down and then get the jump at the right time can make the difference.
Okay. How about you, JP, in terms of like either looking at rosters at a time or when you see opponent and look at what they're bringing, how does that affect or categorize the way you're game planning against a particular roster?
Well, I think it's important to point out that, like, even though David has these 5 categorizations, there can be like rosters that have more than one of these
Sure.
archetypes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
You can have a mid-range list that can go tall. You can have a wide attrition list that can go tall. You can have a scenario, an aggressive scenario that can pivot to like a defensive scenario. So, I mean, I do agree there's nuance, but yeah, I think generally speaking, like when you sit down and look at a list, you're like, you can kind of identify if they want to score, if they want to beat you up, or if they kind of are occupying that like ambiguous area of maybe being a mid-range team. And then like how, I guess it does like kind of change how you plan to play against them though. Whether or not they have prio and can grab a mid extract and then just rotate on you, or if they're gonna like try to bull you on points and you have to have people who can throw or push them off, or identifying if you are the scoring team and they're the beatdown, and then trying to formulate a game plan in a team, like compose a team that can best do that. Knowing the little nuances will probably help you a little bit more than just generally speaking, looking at a list and kind of seeing what they might do. Knowing the possibilities, the nuance of possibilities might give you an edge in some games.
Okay.
Depending on like
And
what
I
level
know
you're playing and what list you're playing against.
Okay.
Well, and I know a lot of the top, like the really good players, will also sometimes they'll build like they'll build like a 15 researcher like package where they're like, on this particular crisis, if I end up at this threat, this is what I'm going to build. But it's like it can be hidden in the characters, right? Like maybe they just like maybe their 10th character is Mal, just in case they want to be able to go tall on 15 research, right?
So in other words, there's rosters that there's a difference between being mid-range and kind of being a jack of all trades and having options to pivot to different archetypes is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. Are those, like, when you're talking about pivots, are you usually talking about pivoting to a different way to do the same thing? Or are you talking about like pivoting to, like, from scoring to attrition or from attrition to scoring?
Well, I mean, it might be simple as having a pivot to a different leadership that just does a different thing with its different characters and tactics cards, right?
Okay. So,
Like
since
going
you,
back to the thing I was talking about Mal, right? So Mal is a leader, right? So if you could have like the most aggressive scoring roster that you could come up with, and then you could throw Mal in and go, okay, at 15 research, I do this Mal, a 5 and a 3 plan, right? And that makes it like Webs could do this for the example, they could go, okay, maybe I'll play Mal, Zemo, and ASM as my 5, right? And then I can run Cabal leadership. I don't know if that's any good, but I mean, it's something you could do, right?
so since you've kind of had the 5 archetypes, since you've been thinking about it this way, um, let's start with it this way. What, if anything, has changed in terms of your roster building thinking?
Well, it leads me to start to think about like what because like for example, I played Webs for a ton of time, right?
Mhm.
And research was always like my like bane. Like I could never win a game on research.
Okay.
And so like I had to start looking at going, okay, maybe whatever I'm doing is not the right game plan on research. Maybe I need to come up with a completely different idea of what to run on research
You just
specifically,
roll
right?
better.
Yeah, that too. But it just becomes like maybe you design a way to have a package for what you think, because sometimes crises are going to fall out of favor, like, or sometimes they're going to come back in favor and like back and forth, right? So like maybe it'll be a while and like nobody's playing research or nobody's playing Fisk, and then all of a sudden this roster arc that comes out of nowhere that's like playing Fisk, and you're like, well, crap, now I have to have a plan for Fisk. And so having the ability to figure out when you need to have a plan for something like that is kind of where this is coming from.
Okay.
So to go back and clarify on David's Webs 15, I was like scratching my head for a second until I figured out what he was talking about. So he was talking about like putting Mal in,
Yeah.
and like typically you'll see a lot of Webs lists that run Zemo already because he's a long mover. He can reroll if he's holding or contesting an objective. He can reroll skulls, and he has Master Swordsman and Strategic Genius, so he can just like reroll the shit out of somebody and be like a really heavy hitting 3 threat in Webs, as well as like a long mover. He's just kind of stupid. So a lot of Webs will run him, and then you're probably already running ASM. So David's essentially saying like you use your 10th slot to take a Mal, and then maybe slot in. I mean, Zemo's affiliated Cabal, and then you slot in ASM as your 5, which is like the minimum impact to your roster would be like just your 10th slot and like maybe a couple tactics cards.
Yeah.
Like you would take Dark Rain and maybe like Midnight Phantasmagoria.
Yeah, something like that.
But like Webs, they're not really greedy on tactics cards anyway. Like they kind of run,
Especially not now. Yeah.
they kind of like running like maybe 6 tactics cards, and like the other ones are just kind of whatever.
Especially now that no matter the cost,
Mission objective, no matter the
mission
cost.
objective. Yeah. They lost a few tactics cards there, so
Yeah.
it's easy to just fill one of those in the slot.
Like you could to like go a little farther, you could sacrifice your 9th slot and take like Red Skull 2.
Yeah, you could. You could.
And I don't know if that's worth it, because then you're down to 8 slots. It's kind of changing the flexibility of a webs list, but it's also shoring up a weakness that you might have running into, like, running face first on a researcher at 15. This is like a pretty big feels bad for webs. Unless they can land on maybe scoundrels.
Yeah.
They might have a shot there. But like landing
Well,
on
and
a researcher and a D just kind of sucks.
well, and they have to have the ability to pick threat too. Like if they landed on scoundrels at 20, that's like they can work with that. But like when you get scoundrels and researcher on 15, that's like it's not always great.
Yeah, I mean, definitely you want more points for sure. Just having five secures though, I think
It's good. Yeah, that's ideal, right? But
yeah,
you're
and
probably going to end up on a D or
they're
whatever
within
you bring
striking
as your-
distance of the researcher. Like if you're contesting Ds, like you're not interacting with the researcher or people contesting it at all. So you're kind of playing a losing game. I think definitely the best thing to land on would be scoundrels if you're going into, if you like low roll into researcher. But anyway, yeah, Mal 9th or 10th slot. That's kind of what David was talking about.
Okay. Alex, what are your thoughts? Just kind of give me a summary of what your thoughts are in terms of how you would use something like this if you're preparing a roster. How would this help you focus what your plan would be on a roster build?
Well, it's really just kind of, to be perfectly honest, my first thought is, what do I want to play? Because there's some affiliations I don't want to necessarily play to begin with. But going past that, it kind of gives me an idea, or like my thought process is, really, do I just want the game to end quickly, and how do I want to end it quickly? Myself personally, I would say that most of the lists that I'm looking for, if it is like attrition, it's wide attrition, or if it's scoring, it's the slow score. And I would then say one step further, I prefer mid range, just being able to do everything. But I just like to play the game, so it's not necessarily a matter of picking it because it's the best. But yeah, that's just kind of where I start. It's just a matter of how quickly do I want to win the game, and how do I want to do it.
Okay.
I think generally speaking, the scenario teams want to end the game by like round 3 or 4, and the attrition teams want to take it out to as deep water as they can.
Right.
I mean,
Right,
unless
but
they
like,
get like super lucky and just table them, but
I could also see like my thought process was like wide attrition. I feel like has a better chance of tabling quicker than a tall attrition. Just like my 2 cents on it, but I can see arguments both ways. Just really depending on what you're playing.
I feel like since the nerf of CGR, I've seen a lot fewer tablings,
Yeah,
Agreed.
me too.
Agreed.
and also the nerf of Mal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like this-
that was just an example I was giving. I know like wide attrition doesn't necessarily, and like attrition now doesn't necessarily want to table. It's just an example I gave.
I don't know if they ever wanted to like table, but like it just happened to it just happened more often.
Agreed.
I
Yeah.
feel like in a certain window of time of the meta, like I was like, wow, I tabled my opponent again. It was just weird. Now I haven't tabled my opponent in a long time.
Well, and I think that probably was just an indictment on the design of those particular characters, where, I mean, you really weren't playing the game as it was intended to be played anymore, because they were so lethal that you could just, screw it, I'll just drop a nuke on it and be done with it.
I mean, you could say the same thing about dweebs, right?
Yeah.
Like if like you lose at the end of round 3, you're just like, oh well, okay, you have 18 points. I guess I lose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose. I guess I don't know. I guess I guess I always go back to the only because I'm usually so bad at remembering that the game isn't about necessarily about punching things. It's about getting to 16, and I mean that's one thing webs are real laser focused on is to get to 16. But I suppose I think you're probably right in the sense that punching is at least at some level part of the game.
I mean, they do have rules for both, right?
It's fair. It's
You're
fair.
supposed to be able to play different ways. Some people
Yes.
just are really good at playing one way, and I
Yeah,
mean, threat level has a lot to do with it too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So
Well, the other thing too is I think that majority of the rosters in the game are in the mid-range category. Like most of the rosters in the game are in that range. And then you've got the skew ends, right?
so
Not
let's
because
just
they wanted to be in the mid range, but they just weren't smart enough to be dweebs or big enough to be weightlifters. So
Yeah, pretty
that's
much.
just where they ended up.
I'm trying to figure out how this ceased to be a Marvel Crisis Protocol podcast and started to be a commentary on my existence in high school. I'm uncomfortable at this point. David, so can you let's just so we're clear. Can you just kind of give some kind of concrete examples as like these are sort of the purest distilled of each of the 4 of the archetypes. I mean, I'm not sure a purely distilled mid-range team isn't an oxymoron, but for the other 4, what are the clearest examples of those archetypes?
Well, I mean, the clearest scoring ones are obviously basically you're looking at any of those teams that can do weird shenanigans to get extracts on round 1. So X-Men have first class and they
Yep.
have like a lot of speed, and Xavier's leadership lets you do ridiculous things with power. So they can do some crazy stuff. And
Okay.
then webs are just fast and they have a lot of what I consider like early game tankiness. Like ASM is a pain in the ass early game because you don't have a lot of ability to dump like spenders into him or things that are like you're forcing larger dice pools into him. So like when you're rolling like 4 and 5 dice attacks into ASM and he's just like, okay, I equip that, I block all of it, whatever.
Right.
So like they have a lot of characters that are like that. Like Cat is another example too. Like she's tanky early game because it's harder to put dice pools in her.
Right.
And so these kind of characters can just go out and steal extracts and go, okay, well, I'm safe at least for round 1, probably 2, right? And that's how they would structure it. I also think you could do shenanigans with maybe Inhumans, but Inhumans gets a little weird because they have an expensive leader. So it ends up like awkward for them to try to fit into the scenario game because obviously anytime you're playing the scenario game, you really want the ability to have more models so you can score more, right? And 5 threat leaders kind of make that weird.
Inhumans are kind of like those edgelords that might shoot up the school.
Yeah. They can throw down some beatdown too though. I mean, they can throw down some beatdown. They're just crazy enough.
So, I guess I'm trying to think about what would you suggest, and maybe we'll just kind of I'll kind of go around to each of the 3 of you. What would you, for a listener who is either thinking about how to put one of their lists together or how to get better at being able to respond to what they're seeing across from the table? David, how would you how would you advise that listener to use this concept of the archetypes to help them?
Well, from this perspective of like when you're sitting down and playing a game, you can generally look at your opponent's like you're going to look at your opponent's list of characters and you're going to look at the crisis that they have. And you're going to go, okay, I see, like I see a bunch of like I see 2 5 scoring crisis and I see senators. Okay, so I'm assuming that you're trying to play an aggressive scoring team. And you know, then you can look at their secures and kind of go, okay, maybe they have maybe they're like X-Men and they have pay to flips for their secures. So then you're like, okay, if I get my extracts, it's going to go this way. If I get my secures, it's going to go this way, right? So you can kind of differentiate what you think your best plan is to do.
Okay. JP, what do you think? How do you if you're giving advice to a listener who's kind of try to level things up, how would you use this kind of a thought process to help them either in list building or in game day preparation?
Okay, so game day prep. I think you got to look at the scenarios first. Because, like I was saying earlier, it's kind of going to boil down to like they're playing hyper attrition, hyper scenario, or something in the middle.
Okay.
And then there's like more granulation after that. But like the scenarios are kind of like the scenarios don't lie. So if it's like, all like 2Ds and scoundrels and then like high scoring extracts and then it's webs and it's all webs. And then it's like, okay, well, they're going to be playing webs and trying to score, and they're going to have one turn where they can web me up and do some damage. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of counterplay to that. Mission objectives gone. You could, like, bodyguards aren't very common, but if you're fortunate enough to have an affiliation with bodyguard, that can help if against venom blasts and things. It's tough. Like, you might. It depends on the flexibility of your list too. Like, if you're just playing a list that doesn't have a lot of control, you're trying to probably beat them down before they can score. You might consider playing control and trying to win on secures and beat them down in the meantime. Like, kind of even out a little bit, slow the game down. Conversely, if they're running like ships, virus, and researcher, and like, gamma and demons and intrusions or whatever, that they're a beat down list. If you're playing a beat down, then it's just like the better dice pools are going to win. If you're playing mid-range, you're obviously going to try to outscore them. And if you're playing a scenario, you're obviously going to try to outscore them. And then the mid-range stuff, like, that's where it gets weird. I think the hyper scenario
Mid-range
stuff
on mid-range is definitely a weird.
Well, it's just weird. Like, if you end up on like scrolls and paranoia, or not scrolls and scrolls and scoundrels, it's like,
yeah.
The scenario team is really happy with that. They're like, there's 9 points on the board, and I'm better at scoring than you. So you just have to have a plan for that if you're bringing mid-range. It's gonna be some sort of like probably extract. Like, say you're playing foes or something, and you bring like well-laid plans, or rhino or whatever. Like, you're trying to do something to give you back a little bit of power over the extracts, or you just kind of go into the mode where you're just going to control and get them off the secures, or you just go into beatdown which, like, only having 10 slots in the list, I guess it's kind of hard to cover all the bases of the mid-range team. That's just kind of the way it is.
Shout out to never playing. You should never play foes without Rhino. Never do that. Always have Rhino.
Yeah.
Always Rhino. Never go around.
And as far as like list building, for your second question, Patrick, I guess you can kind of reverse engineer what I said about all that stuff to build a list. Oh, one other thing, like if they're running a researcher, that should be like an instant red flag, and gamma, to a certain extent, should be a red flag as well. You need to be thinking, like, the reason I say that is because they score. Well, I mean, researcher is its own thing. Like being able to just not have an extract on the board is completely changes the dynamic. But the two of those have a 15 threat, which can be very influential on a game where you have way fewer points or way fewer threat on the board, and they're like beating the shit out of you. Once you start losing a model or two, you have way less agency on the board at 15.
Well, and that's
So,
like the 15 threat is like the tall attritions. Like that's what they want, right?
yeah.
Because that's
So
where they thrive.
So you should be looking at that list and being like, or that roster and being like, what can they bring at 15? And they probably have a good game plan. I think it's tough. I think you need a plan for researcher specifically, and then a plan for 15. Because if you go like 4 wide into 3 wide, it's really against you statistically, because they're gonna have prio at least by round 2, and they're gonna be able to daze a guy and then pick him up on the next round without even passing you prio. And if they do it right, and you can kind of make it hard for them by playing more cagey, but if they do it right, they're taking your best model off the board.
Yeah.
So it's probably like a 4 or 5 threat model. If you're playing down 4 or 5 threat after round 3, and that's not a good place to be when you're facing down like a kaiju plus 2 henchmen or double kaiju
Well,
or
and
whatever.
if you're playing like 4 wide, I mean, you're probably assuming that your leader is going to be like a 4 threat. So like maybe they just punk your leader early, and then now you don't have a leadership. So like,
Yeah, you could go like 5-4-3-3 or 4-4-4-3, something like that. But I think you really have to be cognizant of the threat level in researcher specifically as a non beatdown list. Obviously, if you're a beatdown list, you probably have a plan for that anyway, and you're probably running them. So that's another thing. Like if you're preparing for an event and you're running beatdown, you're gonna run gamma, you're gonna run researcher, and you're gonna figure out your 15. You're gonna figure out your like best 15 team and or teams that you can make. You might have like you definitely want a 3 tall team, and then you might have some other plans in case you run into a team that wants to go wide. And it also, like if it's gamma and you have like a 5 wide extract, obviously you want to go a little wider. So like a little flexibility there, but you definitely want like a 3 tall team if you're running those two.
Alex, any additional thoughts in terms of the archetypes as tools for either list building or game day prep?
Not really. David and JP covered a lot of what I was going to say. The only thing that I would add to it is also obviously a big deal and like something to figure out is just to practice with it, because some of the crises play similar to each other, whether one be an extract and the other be a secure. Not necessarily how it's played, but more so how quickly it scores. Like one thing that I can think of as an example would be no, I can't even use this as an example. I was going to say legacy. and intrusions, but legacy you can score the 6 points. Well, I don't remember the thought process I was going with it at that point because.
Well, I'll jump in here then,
I guess-
Alex. I think certain ones are like really awkward for a lot of players. So if you're running them, you want to practice them. The ones I'm thinking of,
I mean that's
the ones
yeah,
I'm thinking of
for sure.
are like Bisque and Alien Ship. Those two are really awkward to play because if you mess up, you kind of messed up.
It's sometimes paranoia. Paranoia can be awkward too.
Yep. Yeah. I was also thinking like in comparison, like a comparison thing, like intrusions. If you screw up, you screw up. Because like just based on the dice rolls themselves, and the same can be said about aliens. Like if you have too much power and the dice just say you're going to take 3 damage, I mean it's kind of a screw up.
Well, it's not only that; it's like if you castle, right? Like your game plan. If your list wants to castle and then you play in like ships, and then you castle and you roll 2 successes on your 2, like you're blowing up, you're doing like 8 damage maybe or something. It can be really bad really quick. And I agree, intrusions as well. That one's one that people should probably practice on also, because hopping through portals, like the decision tree gets fucking crazy, and also you drop extracts when you do it, so there's a lot to consider when you're playing on that.
Yeah, just more so on like
just
practicing them. It's a huge deal because some of them score. My point is they can score at the same pace, but play completely differently.
Well, and sometimes on like intrusions, right? Like a character like Hulk can like daze a model, port through, and then KO another model, right? On the completely other side of the table. So it gets weird.
I think I remember that game, David.
It's what like I don't know the exact math because I can't remember which symbols your opponent places on intrusions, but it's what skull and blank your opponent places you, or skull shield your opponent places you.
You get skull blank.
Skull blank. It's skull blank.
Okay, so
you have a 3 out of 5, 3 out of 8 chance to get it wrong.
Yeah, so it's just for ease of math, I know it's not 100% right, but about 66% of the time you're getting to go where you want to go. But you could roll double skull twice in a row, especially if you're interacting multiple times to try to get where you need to go.
Right. You can pay 2 power and you have a 3 in 16 chance of still not ending up where you want to go. I think that's the right math.
Yeah.
You should just have a plan. You should have a plan. Like, if I mess up this roll, my opponent, if he's smart, or she, shout out to all the females who play this game. If he or she is smart, they're going to put me exactly here. And what am I going to do when I get placed there? And then if I try to hop through this portal and I get put back on my original spot, what's my plan?
Right.
You just got to think it out a little bit more. And kind of like cut, like, I mean, it's like risk reward. You got to figure out where you lie on that.
Right. You think through, okay, if 3 and 8 hits and I end up here, if 3 and 16 hits and I end up here, is the juice worth the squeeze?
Yeah.
Okay. David, this is kind of your this was your idea, and I think it's been a start of a really good conversation. If nothing else, I know it's going to help me when I'm doing roster building to kind of make sure I've thought through everything. And so it's like, okay, what am I going to do against an aggressive scoring team? What am I going to do against a defensive scoring team? So I know if nothing else, it's just going to help me make sure I've thought through everything. Any other kind of broader thoughts or anything else that the conversation that we've had has sort of generated with you on the concept of the archetypes?
Not really. Just, if you can learn something from it and you can learn how to kind of guess what your opponent's doing, and you're going to turn out, I mean, eventually you're going to get better at recognizing, and your like win-loss rate will get better. Like, Just things to consider.
Yep. JP, anything else?
Dweebs are lame, and they have no counterplay.
But they
They do have a very high floor, though.
Yeah.
I think they're probably one of the more skill-intensive affiliations in the game.
Yeah.
They have a high floor, high ceiling.
Yeah.
But I do think they are probably still the best team in the game. This is a very subjective thing. It's obviously my opinion, but I do think there are a large constituent of players who still agree with me. But like I said, they are difficult to play, and if shit goes wrong, it can definitely go wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I do think, though, I think having teams like Webs that really do play the game in a different way than most other affiliations do. I think it's good for the game that it has that. So I'll still stump on that. Alex, anything else that the archetype concept has kind of fostered in you before we leave it for the evening?
I will say it definitely helped me kind of step out of my comfort zone of what I would normally play. Just having that mindset of kind of adapting and having game plans for multiple situations. For a while, I only played Web Warriors because I like Spider-Man, but then thinking of the different archetypes really got me out of my comfort zone. And then I started playing, criminal syndicates, even though it wasn't. Oh no, it was almost the exact opposite because I was playing more so Wide Attrition with that. So it made me really step out of my comfort zone, and I like having that different kind of puzzle to solve when you have to think on both sides and doing all the practice.
Yeah, in the draft league that we've got going, I've sort of accidentally fallen into playing an aggressive scoring team, and it's the first time I've tried it, and it's kind of fun. So it's been good for me to branch out on that too. So, well,
So all the shit that I've talked about Webs, I think they've been on my list to play for a while. I think I might start playing them because I'm just like tired of this game's dice right now.
You should.
Also, if David's inspired any of you out there, if he's like blown your mind or opened up pathways in your thinking, we're gonna have a link. It'll be a link to Google Maps with David's address in the description, and feel free to like write him like a thank you or a love letter or whatever. Conversely, if you think his idea is completely absurd and he's a fucking quack, he does accept package bombs. So follow the link.
well, on that note, Webheads, if you have thoughts, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe not the package bomb type, but we would love to hear your thoughts about the archetypes. You can reach out to us on all of the socials at wittybantercast.com. That includes Twitter/X, that includes Facebook, that includes Instagram, that includes YouTube, that includes TikTok. We are all over the frickin' place, and everything is Witty Bantercast. So let us know what you think. We'd love to hear how you're using these archetypes, whether you've been using these archetypes and you haven't really thought about it, or whether you can see something else that that maybe we haven't talked about. You can get in touch with us on the socials. You can get in touch with us by email at wittybantercast@gmail.com. We also, just to remind you, the next episode we're going to have, we will be announcing the winner of our next giveaway. So if you want to get an entry, you can leave us a rating and a review on your podcast of choice. And you can also become a Patreon, patreon.com/wittybantercast. That can help us. It helps support us. It helps keep us going in terms of what we're doing. And it also helps grow the community. It helps grow the neighborhood so that we can have more of a conversation with you guys, which is what we'd like to do. So thanks you all for being here. We look forward to hearing what you think about with regards to the archetypes. We will be back. We will be announcing the winner of the next giveaway when we get back together next time. So until then, webheads, until next time, be good.